Hello, a very warm welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Sanam Shantier. Coming up on this week's show, a French Special Forces soldier is killed in combat as part of the US-led coalition of nations battling the Islamic State group. We'll bring you a special report from the operation on the ground in Iraq. Inside Egypt's housing crisis, with building regulations often ignored, collapses are not unusual in this country. Also coming up, African migrants in Israel feeling unwanted and unwelcome. Some are even facing deportation. We start with Iraq's border with Syria, where French special forces are taking part in the fight against the Islamic State group. One French paratrooper has even been killed during the operation. Now, several months ago, French television journalists followed the elite forces on the ground. Here's a look at their findings.
French special forces start their day preparing an observation drone. It's become the best way to pinpoint fighters from the Islamic State group. It flies at an altitude of over 1,000 meters and has become an indispensable weapon in the fight against the jihadists. We're now close to the Syrian border, where French soldiers are analyzing photographs and video which will be sent to an airbase once the files are encrypted. The jihadists aren't far away, but the special forces aren't here to engage with them directly in combat. They are here instead to train Kurdish fighters.
We set up in the house, we set up the surveillance, and we start to see where their shots are coming from. They begin in the evening, it's normal. These are the working hours for Daesh.
Not far away, Iraqi forces continue in their fight against the enemy, while France's special forces blend in the midst of chaos.
They aren't far, at around 600-700 meters. They infiltrate, they fire, they go back.
Weaponry is put in place in case of a direct attack on this position.
I hope not.
Elite forces use other observational tools to keep an eye on the enemy.
We prefer to try to see the threat before it sees us.
For soldiers who usually work in the shadows, nightfall isn't a problem.
In this type of village, there is normally no civilian activity. According to the Peshmerga, there is only enemy activity. So if we see movement in a building or a vehicle, we know it's the enemy.
Around 200 special forces are tasked with surveying the border between Iraq and Syria. On the ground, they work with allied soldiers. Here in Mosul, they work with Iraqi forces as they step into potential booby traps.
The detonator is interesting because it's necessary to make traps and set off bombs.
The task of special forces is often dangerous and delicate. This as they try and understand how jihadists operate.
Now to some stories making waves across the region. 3 Israelis have been killed in a gun attack by a Palestinian assailant in a settlement in the occupied West Bank. The gunman, a 37-year-old, was also shot and died later. The attack came as US envoy Jason Greenblatt was due in Jerusalem for talks on relaunching the peace process. For millions of Kurds, Monday was a historic day. They took to polls in their millions to vote in a non-binding referendum on their independence, and it's been meeting criticism from across the region and even further afield from the United States. Turkey has even threatened Iraqi Kurds with military intervention. Now, residents of tower blocks in Alexandria are dicing with death as many of the structures violate building laws. Some have even collapsed, killing those inside or crushing passers-by. France 24's Delano de Souza brings you the story.
This building shows all the telltale signs of dilapidation, and despite its leaning structure, still remains inhabited.
The residents go in and out, and all of the apartments are occupied, and they don't have problems with it up top. The building is tilted, but they're living here normally.
The building's owner tried alerting local authorities, but it was impossible to get them to change their rules.
So the local government gave me the option to restore it, but not to tear it down. So I told them, I'm not responsible for the building if it collapses. That's what I want to tell you. If anything happens to the building or its residents, I'm not responsible.
This is far from an isolated case in Alexandria, a city where poorly constructed buildings are common. Dozens of lives are lost after apartment blocks collapse, often at the rate of one a year. This tilted building had to be evacuated immediately and risks toppling other structures if it collapses. Engineers say the city's planning needs to be revisited.
In the field of real estate investment in Alexandria, most people who are working are not in fact engineers. And what's bizarre is that they also do not hire engineers to work for them. This means they work without any professional engineering expertise at all.
Buildings quickly sprung up in the city to respond to growing demand, often bending the rules and risking security. 4.5 million people live in Alexandria, making it the second most populated city in Egypt after Cairo.
Now to Israel, where tens of thousands of Africans who've survived a perilous journey across the Sinai Peninsula and sought asylum are now living in limbo. Some even fear deportation, although they've lived in the country for over a decade.
African hairdressers and restaurants line the streets of this South Tel Aviv neighborhood. Some 38,000 African migrants are living in Israel, according to official data, most from Eritrea and Sudan. Many have settled in this area, but they face hostility from Israeli residents and the threat of deportation.
Do you know what all migrants, Eritreans, Sudanese dream of? It's simple. Their dream and mine is to return to our countries. But for the moment, it's totally impossible. And if I'm deported to Rwanda or Uganda, I know exactly what might happen to me. I came to Israel to be safe.
Israeli Premier Benjamin Netanyahu visited the neighborhood in August, saying he wanted to return it to Israelis. He was responding to the complaints of some residents who resent the presence of the migrants living there. Some aid groups say the migrants meet the UN definition of refugees, but are trapped by contradictory rules. Their visas don't give them the right to work, but to renew them they must show pay slips to prove employment. Israel has granted refugee status to only a handful so far. Migrants intercepted along the border between Israel and Egypt are held at this center in the Negev desert.
The authorities chose this place to make life harder for us in Israel. They want us to suffer here and leave the country. That's the goal of this place.
In August, Israel's Supreme Court ruled that the migrants can be held for no more than 60 days, sparking demonstrations in South Tel Aviv and recriminations from the political right. But Prime Minister Netanyahu has already said he will find a way around the decision.
We end this week's show with Egypt's nomination for the Best Foreign Language Film category at the next year's Oscars. Sheikh Jackson tells the story of an ultra-conservative Muslim cleric torn by his love of, yes, you guessed it, Michael Jackson. Let's listen to the director, Amr Salama, who had to work through 11 drafts before the story finally made it to life.
I think my purpose as a filmmaker is to make films that can humanize the other and cross bridges between between all the peoples that have prejudice against each other, or like judge each other or stereotyping each other.
We'll leave you with some images from Sheikh Jackson. Thank you for watching Middle East Matters.
حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح. King of Pop Michael Jackson.
ومين المغني ده؟
ده أشهر مغني في الدنيا كلها.
علمني حلمي المحال أشب فوق الخيال.